So my name is Joris Kuipers. I work for a company called Trifork. I've been working for that for almost 6 years now, as mostly as a hands-on architect. Recently also became CTO. Kenny was mentioning the Axon framework that came out of Trifork. It was developed by a former colleague of mine called Alex Buizen. And recently he and some other people spun this off into their own company called Exonic, which is why they needed this new CTO. I have a background mostly in Spring. I used to work for SpringSource as a trainer and consultant, so usually I do talks on Spring related stuff. But then for this year, for the JFall conference from the NLJUG, I decided to switch topics and show that I can talk about other things than Spring. So I did a Flyway talk, and one of the organizers of this meetup after that talk contacted me and said, well, that might be interesting to do on this continuous delivery meetup as well. Which is why I'm here. So when it comes to the tool that I'll be explaining, Flyway, I've been using it for a couple of years already in production on a number of projects, and while doing that I came up with some, let's say, usage patterns, and I have assembled those into this presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick intro to Flyway, the tool itself, for those of you not familiar with that yet, show what it can do and what its purpose is, and then after that I'm going to talk about some more advanced use cases and how you can apply them when you start doing this in real life, so to speak. So Flyway is a tool that can help you with evolving your database schema. So if you're working with a relational database, that's what this tool is aimed at. So it has a schema. Then obviously, as you are developing more code and you're putting it in production, that means you have to deal with schema changes. You have to add new tables, you have to maybe do renames, you have to do additions, that sort of thing. You need to manage that somehow. The question is, how do you do things like tracking changes to your database? First of all, you have to track it somewhere. Otherwise, when you go to production, you have no idea what needs to change to the current schema to get it to the next version. So, for example, a project that I've been working on, when I joined that project probably around 4 years ago now, what they would do is they would have a single file in version control. Let's say that the current release was maybe version 17, and we were working on the next major release called version 18. They would have a file, something like migration 17 to 18.sql. That would just track all of the new DDL statements, like, oh yeah, we need to add this new table for this new feature, and we need to add a new column here, and maybe we need to enlarge this column a little bit, because it turned out that the var 255 was actually a bit too short. And they would just put that in a file and track it like that. Then at least you know, from release to release, what it is that you need to be doing. But then the question becomes, well, if you're actually going to deploy your application, then how do you ensure that whatever is in that file actually gets deployed? And it's one thing if you are on a traditional schema where maybe you just deploy a couple of times per year and you will go through the whole DTAP thing and you know exactly what is where, but it becomes much trickier. If you are going to do things like continuous deployment, you might have multiple environments, they might not all be on the same version, and obviously if you're just going to have a single file to track these sorts of changes, it can also happen that this file itself gets applied to an environment, and then people start adding stuff. So then all of a sudden you have this situation where, well, half of it was there, half of it wasn't. You need to manually find out, okay, apparently we got to this bit, but then this was added, so we still need to apply those changes. And even if you would do that, then you have to hope that people didn't actually change everything that you thought was applied already, because maybe there was a bug in there and someone fixed it. But, well, the bug was already rolled out, you don't know about it. So tracking these things by hand, even if you do it in version control, becomes unmanageable very, very quickly on any project of a decent size. So that's exactly the problem that Flyway aims to solve. It's a tool, it's written in Java, but you can use it for basically anything because it can run as a standalone tool, in addition to being run as part of a Java-based application. That will track things called migrations. So a migration, as I will explain later on, is typically just a single SQL file with a couple of DDL statements. That logically makes sense.
Does it also create update or rollback scripts for
no.
like the DBA work?
No. because I should say no until the very latest version 5, which now has multiple versions, open source plus commercial, and actually the commercial will try to do something like this.
Okay.
But originally, Flyway made a design decision to say there is no generic mechanism for doing rollbacks. If you're going to say create table, okay, then it's easy enough, you can do a drop table. If you're going to do a rename, or if you're going to do a drop, then there is no generic way of rolling that back. So basically, the Flyway philosophy is that if you, I'll talk a bit more about it later on, they will do transactional migrations, but that only works if your database supports transactional DDL statements. And apart from that, if you want to get back to a known state, that's up to you. You have to have database backup.
And normally, if you have CI/CD in place correctly, then you would always deploy a new version when something goes wrong.
Yes, exactly. You would do a roll forward. Yeah.
But you would not have to roll back your database because you haven't applied any user updates to the tables, right? No, you've not changed any records yet.
No, but there's a difference, of course, between changing records and changing data and changing the schema. Flyway can do both, so it's up to you how you want to use that, and based on how you're using it, depends on how you can actually undo some stuff. But I'll get more into this. So what Flyway does is it tracks the changes that it has made, and basically it does that in a very simple way. It has its own dedicated table, and it will simply record all of the applied migrations there, including some metadata, like how long did it take, when was it done, in what order were things done. I'll show you in a moment. Then it's going to check, okay, but what migrations are available? So that might be something that is simply part of your application if you're embedding Flyway. That's how I typically apply it. But you, like I said, you can run this as a separate tool as well. So on the one hand, it will have a list and it will say, oh yeah, apparently I already applied 12 migrations. And then it checks what migrations are available and it finds 15 migrations available. And then it says, okay, well, the first 12 indeed have been applied already. Then I have 3 more that weren't applied. So I'm just going to execute those migrations. In part of doing this, it will perform a number of validations typically to ensure that your database starts out in a known correct state, and that it will end up in a known correct state as well, and that it doesn't inadvertently introduce breakage. So if you only remember one thing, right, what Flyway does is provides version control for your database. So I'll talk a little bit more about this applying of migrations, and after that I'll get into the usage patterns. So how does it work when you start up Flyway and it's going to do its thing? Well, the first thing basically it's going to do is it's going to find what migrations are available. So as I said, a migration is typically a SQL file. You just write it yourself. You can use the native SQL syntax for the particular database that you're using, because especially when you're writing DDL statements, right, things like create tables, that sort of thing, that is not standardized completely from database to database. So typically you want to have some vendor-specific syntax in there to configure things. It is also possible, but I won't be talking about it a lot in this presentation, to write a Java class that acts as a migration. That's nice if you want to execute some migration that involves some logic. I've used that, for example, to do things like encrypting certain data in my database. Right? You could do that in SQL. Well, I'm a Java developer, I prefer to do these things in Java. It will look for these migrations in a specified location. By default, that's just some path under a class path, but you can configure this. And again, I'll talk about this a bit more. And a migration file just conforms to a certain naming convention, and that convention can be seen here. If you start out with a V, that's called a version migration. That's typically what I just refer to as a migration when I talk about Flyway. They have also support for another type of migrations called repeatable migrations, but I won't be talking about that, but the concept is similar. If you have a version migration, it has a version. That's the whole idea. So this one has version 9. You can pad that thing with leading zeros. Flyway will just ignore it, but it's nice if you have, well, let's say more than 10 migrations, right? You probably want the alphabetic sorting to be the same as the numerical sorting for your version, so we typically use some padding. Then you see double underscore here, and everything that comes after the double underscore is just a description. It explains what's in the file. Flyway will ignore it, or it will actually save it to the database, but doesn't actively do anything with it. But you can use that yourself to see what's happening. This is an example from an actual project that I'm working on, where we're building a medical record system. And here we have some integration with a Dutch system called Zorgmail, which is like a message broker for medical data. And apparently we were adding a feature here to add some columns to the database related to sort. Right? This is a gyration number, so that's what we use as a naming convention so that we can easily see what migrations were related to what user stories. That's just something that you can decide for yourself how you want to deal with that. So once Flyway knows what migrations are available that it could apply to a given database schema, then it's going to check what migrations have been applied to this database already. So Flyway tracks that in its own database table. By default, that thing is called schema version, although with the latest release, that was really just released like 1 or 2 weeks ago, I think. They actually changed the default name for that. I don't remember the new name, but if you're on Flyway version 4, it will be called schema version. And in that database table, it will track, okay, in what ordering, there's something falling off the thing here, but there are numbers here. In what ordering were the migrations applied? What versions were they? Then here is your description. But you see some additional stuff as well, like a checksum, for example. So the checksum will actually is a hash of the contents of your migration. So Flyway can actually see, not only does it know I already applied this file, it can also see, if it finds the file again as an available migration, was it actually unchanged? Because if you change something that was already applied, then there's no guarantee, right? That you don't know if your database is still in the correct state because, well, you ran the script already, but apparently it wasn't the same script. So the rule with Flyway is you shouldn't be changing migration scripts if they have already been applied to a given database, right? You should just have another migration script in that case. You see some other information, when was this run, how long did it take to run, that sort of thing. So that's what it uses for its internal administration. Now, when it knows what migrations are there, and it knows what migrations have been applied already, it can basically just do a diff, and then say, well, all migrations that were not applied already, that's what I need to run. But before it does that, it will typically perform some validations to ensure that your database is in a known consistent state. So first thing it will do at startup is to check, do I have my own schema version table in there already? And if it's missing, it could be because of 2 reasons. Your entire database schema might be empty, so you're running against an empty database. There is nothing in there, no tables whatsoever. In that case, Flyway will automatically create its own schema version table, and then it will start to apply all of the migrations that are available in order. Because you're starting with an empty database, apparently you want it populated. It could also be that the schema version table is missing, but there is a lot of other stuff in your database already. Then by default, Flyway will just fail with an error. It says, hey, I'm being run against the database here, there's all sorts of stuff in there, but I didn't put it in there, maybe you're running against the wrong database. However, I'll talk more about this later on, this could be a very valid situation if you want to start using Flyway on an existing project with an existing database. And there is full support for that, and I'll explain that later on. Then it will do the thing that I explained already. For all migrations that were applied already, it will perform a checksum match against the available migrations. It has to match. Because if you change something after the fact, after you applied it already, all bets are off. Flyway cannot guarantee that your database is indeed in the state that it should be in after running that migration, because, well, you cannot just rerun it, but something changed, so it fails. You have to figure out who fucked up, basically, when you change your migration. Also, it could be that in that database table, it says, oh, I already applied a migration with version number 18. But then Flyway says, well, I have no idea what migration version 18 is because it's not in my list of available migrations anymore. And again, by default, it will fail if that happens. Because it might be a sign that something went wrong, people have inadvertently removed stuff, or maybe you're deploying the wrong thing. So again, just to be on the safe side, it will fail by default if this is the case, and you can disable that check, of course. Also, if you have new migration, so the stuff that it still needs to apply, and by default, those new migrations should always have a higher version number than all of the migrations that were applied already. So let's say that you have applied migrations versions 1, 3, and 4. Then it's absolutely fine if it finds a new migration called version 5 or version 6. But if it finds a new migration called version 2, and it says, well, I haven't applied version 2 yet, but my database is already on version 5, again, that's tricky, right? Maybe you have some dependency between your migrations and they should run in order. But it cannot run in order if it's actually in older version. So again, by default, it will fail on that, But again, of course, you can disable that, and I will show you some valid use cases for disabling that check. So once all of this stuff is done, it will actually start to apply your migrations. What that means is, in the case of SQL migrations, it will just execute the SQL that's in your files. In the case of a Java migration, it will just call a method, and then you can use JDBC to execute some statements against your database. Now, by default, it does apply a single transaction per migration file. So if you have 5 migration files that need to be applied, that will be 5 individual database transactions. You can also tell Flyway, I want to execute this whole thing, let's say 5 migrations, as a single database transaction. Now, this functionality only makes sense if your database supports transactional DDL statements, and not every database does this. If you're running on MySQL, well, you're out of luck. You cannot do a create table statement and then do an alter column and then say, oh, something went wrong, I'm going to roll back the whole thing. Simply not supported. However, if you're on something like PostgreSQL, for example, this is fully supported. You can actually do a rollback, which is nice. Then when it's done, it will store the results in that version table that I showed you before, so you can see what happens, and the next time that you run it, it will know what it did already and what it still needs to do. So, in a nutshell, this is basically what Flyway is. Right? So with this knowledge, you could go back to your project, you could start to introduce this, and oh yeah, one thing I should tell is that if something goes wrong during any of the migrations, that will fail Flyway. It will not continue after an error, of course. What will happen exactly depends on if your database has transactional DDL support. If your database doesn't have transactional DDL support, if you're running on MySQL or EDP, whatever, you will get an entry in that schema version table that says this was a failed migration, and then you can fix it, you can then mark it as successful. If you do have transactional DDL support, it simply doesn't even record a line in that table because it can do a rollback of the whole thing. So there's a slight difference there. So inside of a migration, typically you'll have DDL statements that has that, right? Create tables and maybe create views, do some alters, do some additions, whatever it is. However, Flyway doesn't really care. It could be anything as long as it's valid SQL. So you can also use Flyway to do things like insert reference data into your database, right? Very often this is a problem where that I've seen on projects where we have some silly, stupid reference data that hardly ever changes. So you don't really want to build like a whole admin functionality for it inside of an application, but it still needs to be managed somehow. It needs to end up in every database and it needs to be consistent. Things like a country code table maybe, right? That doesn't change all that much, at least not nowadays anymore. A couple of years ago it was actually pretty bad. But then you say, well, yeah, if we have that table, how do I make sure if I have multiple environments and they all have their own database that, well, they actually have a consistent context? Well, Flyway, again, is a perfect tool for that. It's not just restricted to versioning your schema. It can also be used for inserting reference data and that sort of thing. If you need more complexity as part of your migration logic than what you're comfortable in doing in SQL, you can write a Java migration, as I said, because then you can just use JDBC to issue the actual SQL statements, but you can use whatever Java logic you might need in order to perform your migration. That could be literally anything. The example I mentioned already is things like doing maybe some encryption, where the encryption keys should be gotten from some properties that you might have in your Java application, but it can be anything really.
Would it be possible, for example, if you have a transactional, like Oracle PL/SQL, to have instead write your logic in Java, write it, for example, in PL/SQL, which you deploy to the database and then run it?
Yeah, but I would say that in that case, probably defining the procedure itself is something that you might want to do with Flyway. And then after that, yeah, calling it indeed could be another step. But the whole thing of your stored procedures are really just another part of what you store in your database. So managing that is again something, I haven't used that because I don't typically work with stored procedures, but I see no reason why it would work. So yeah, I think that would be a fine idea actually. So some things you need to consider when you want to apply this tool. First of all is, do you want to run this Flyway as part of your application itself? That's what I typically do, because I usually work on applications that connect to the database with a user that actually has rights to alter the database key. And that makes it really very convenient to say, well, I'm just going to package everything up in the application and the expectations about the schema together. When the application starts up, the first thing it does on startup is going to run Flyway, check if everything is in order, apply the migrations, and then it will continue starting up. It will bootstrap maybe JPA or whatever you're using to connect to your database and that sort of thing. That may not be an option in many environments, right? There are plenty of environments where your application will not be allowed to make these type of changes. So you're gonna need a separate user, and it shouldn't be a user that is used by your application. But in that case, well, you can run Flyway as a standalone tool very easily. And it could be part of something like a continuous deployment pipeline, for example, where one step in your pipeline would say, before deploying and starting my application, I'm actually gonna run Flyway to make sure that my database is in the state that my application version expects it to be in, right? I'm lucky enough to work in environments where I don't typically need that, so I typically embed Flyway in my apps. If you do that, do make sure that Flyway runs as the first thing that talks to your database, right? Because all other code in your application will expect the database to be in the final state in terms of the schema. For example, you cannot first bootstrap Hibernate and JPA and then run Flyway, because Hibernate won't like it if it cannot actually find the tables that it expects to be there, right? Flyway should go for it. As I said, an important consideration in deciding on these things is if you have a database user that has DDL changing rights, that sort of thing.
I was wondering, what if you're in a situation in which you should have no downtime, and you have two nodes running,
yeah,
and one node you're doing the migration stuff,
yeah,
and the other node's still running?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So the question is, what do you do with downtime-less deploys, basically, if you have a relational database? There are some patterns for this, and Flyway is an excellent tool to start applying these things, but it doesn't necessarily enforce them or make it easier to use. So, for example, if you want to basically do a blue-green deploy, where you have version X of your application running against the database, and then you deploy version X.1, and it might make some changes to the database as part of being deployed, you have to make sure that those changes are compatible with version X. Yeah. So it's always safe to add a nullable column there. It's always safe to create a new table, but renaming a column is just not done, right? You cannot rename a column if the existing version of the application is still expecting that column to be there. So actually there are collections of patterns on this. There are some good books about it as well. A couple of years ago already there was a book by Scott Ambler called Refactoring Databases that has a lot of these described. So basically what you need to do there is you come up with a scheme where you say, let's say I do want to rename a column. What you're going to do is you're going to first introduce a new column with the desired name, but you're going to keep the existing column in place. Then you're going to make sure that you deploy a new version of the application that will read from the old column, but it will update both columns. Then after a while, you probably have a batch script to populate the remaining empty new column fields that weren't updated already by the application because they weren't changed. Then you can deploy a new version of the application that says, well, I'm going to update the new column and read from the new column, but I'm also going to update the old column in case I need to do a rollback. And when that happens and that's done and that's tested, then you can finally start to deploy an application that says I'm fully on the new column. That's not trivial, right? It requires a lot of planning, it requires a lot of automation, and also, and that's my experience with certain databases like MySQL, for example, even if you would have all of this in place, you're still not going to be able to do deploys without downtime, because adding a new column in MySQL to a database with a couple of million rows, that's just a blocking operation, right? So it depends a lot on your situation if this is even feasible, I would say. But there are well-described patterns on this, and like I said, Flyway doesn't necessarily implement those or anything like that, but it will definitely help you to make sure that this thing is indeed controlled and that every version of application knows exactly what schema it can expect from them. So it helps, but yeah, you still have to do a lot of manual work. And to be honest, I haven't worked on an application yet where we have even tried this. We've thought about this, but because of problems, like I said, with things like adding columns to big tables that will just not scale at all, we decided to just take the hit and say we're going to have downtime occasionally. But your mileage may vary depending on the application and the database that you're using there, obviously. So there was a question about this already. As I said, Flyway doesn't attempt to automatically do things like rollbacks, although they're actually going to introduce this feature now in a commercial variant. But this was pretty much a design decision. And I think it actually makes sense because there is no generic way to do this. So you just need to make sure that you can always have the rollback. What you do have, though, if you're having a transactional DDL statement support, is that you can simply tell Flyway the whole thing should be a single transaction, a whole migration, a whole list of migrations you need to apply. So that means that at least if something goes wrong during migration, you can always roll back to a known state. That definitely helps because it's a big difference if you're just failing and then you're still in the same situation, or if something fails halfway and you need to find out, okay, so this migration script ran, it contained 8 DDL statements, which one of those already made it to the database and on which one did it actually fail? And that's the situation you're going to be in if you don't have transactional DDL support. Right? You cannot do a rollback on that. So definitely helps to have that. Also, and this is true about these sort of automation things in general, but Flyway is no exception there. If you're going to use this, make sure that all of your database changes are in fact managed by Flyway. Otherwise, there is absolutely no guarantee that you will ever be able to reproduce your database schema by running Flyway against an empty database. Right? Also, if people are too quick and say, well, there's going to be a Flyway migration when we go to production, but I'm just by hand, I'm already going to create this one table because I know it will be needed for something else. And obviously, when you do actually run Flyway, it will just fail because it says, I'm trying to create a table that's already there. So don't do that. Have the discipline of actually enforcing that everything will be going through Flyway.
But you say all database changes, so all even data?
No.
Okay.
What I mean here indeed is, so that's a good question, is schema changes and the things that you would like to manage through Flyway. Yeah, obviously Flyway is not in charge of your production data. It's your production schema. Yeah.
What do you do if you have a migration that succeeded on certain databases but failed on others?
What do you mean on certain databases, like on different environments or different DBMSs?
Different environments.
Well, then what you'll see is that, let's say you're deploying this on acceptance and it works fine. Then your schema version table in acceptance will say this is the list of migrations that I applied and they were all successful. And then when you do the same thing on production and something was off on production, because this of course shouldn't happen, but if it does happen, then you will need to find out, because there will be an error and there will be a failed migration, on what it was exactly that caused it to fail.
Probably someone patched it in production.
Well, exactly. That would be the typical scenario, that someone said already, let's just by hand fix this already because I know that this needs to be different.
And then you update the migration and check some changes.
Yeah, that's also a thing that there are situations where you might want to do this, but then you also have to manually fix the checksum in the version table. So again, typically I would advise against it. Yeah.
I heard Kenny say that we shouldn't have OTAPs anymore. But some companies do actually.
Oh yeah, plenty. Don't worry about that. Yeah.
Thousands. And so where does this Flyway reside? Because I can imagine that there's only one instance of Flyway that controls all of your.
No.
Does it sit on every environment?
Yeah, in my case, I typically embed it in my applications. So whenever I deploy an application, it's in the application. So depending on the version of the application that I deploy to a certain environment, it will have a list of migrations.
How do you then ensure that your versioning is consistent across the staging environments?
That's the nice thing about this, it happens automatically. So whenever you deploy an application, the application has a clear, well-defined set of expectations about this is what my database should look like, and if it's not looking like this, these are the steps that I need to take to actually get it into that state, and it will just apply them. So that instead of having to remember, oh yeah, my acceptance is on version this, and my production is on version that, so for acceptance I need to maybe perform a step less because I did it already, but on production we still need to do all of these things. You can just forget about all of this, because Flyway actually manages this for you, and it simply says, well, your application says these are the migrations that should be applied. I see in the database that there is a subset of those migrations that were actually applied already, so I'll just apply the rest.
And how do you keep your software versions then in sync with your database schema versions?
Because the migrations are under source control, and they should be under the same source control as your application code, because they
Okay,
belong.
so that's where you keep them in.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so-
You just make one distribution, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that one.
And even
Yeah.
if you wouldn't embed Flyway in your application, it would still be, I would say, it should still be a single source control system, but it will just have a Flyway artifact that you will deploy for the migration
yeah.
for the database and
Okay,
another
got
one
it.
for you. Yeah, but it would be versioned together
Yeah.
in that case. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's skip that. So that's the intro. Now, when you start applying this, you will see that fairly straightforward to get started with Flyway like this, but then there will be some things as you continue to work with it that will feel something like it's not particularly clear how you want to do certain things. So I actually like the documentation on Flyway when it comes to explaining the concepts and the basic tools, but it doesn't really have a lot of information. Oh yeah, but if you are going into some more real life use cases, this is a good way to apply that. So that's what I want to talk about a bit here. So again, right, when you're talking about continuous delivery, and this is a continuous delivery meetup, you may argue that things like maintenance branches should be a thing of the past, but again, in practice, there are tons of projects, of course, who still do scheduled releases every so often, and then in between those scheduled releases, there might be some bug fix maintenance releases, and in the meantime, you're working on the next big release. This is a pattern that's used quite a lot. So typically, you will just have a master, or you do trunk-based development, for those of you who still know what trunk is, to say this is where my next major release will be, and on the meantime, you have a maintenance branch where it's just going to apply fixes on the production so that you can roll them out without rolling out all of the new features that are not yet complete. If you're going to apply this with Flyway, you might run into some problems if you're doing this naively. So let's say you're just using version numbers that start with 0 and then 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So we're starting with a new project, so database schema is in version 0, then we create a version 1, and then we say, oh, this looks actually good, we're going to bring this into production, right? That would typically involve a bit more, but for the sake of argument here. So now this is our production version, and what we're going to do is we're going to split off a maintenance branch to say, if we need to do any patch, then we're going to do it on that, and in the meantime, on the master, we'll just keep on working on the next major release. So for the next major release, we need some new functionality, which will probably involve some database migrations because we need some new database tables. So we come up with the migration 2, migration 3. And now all of a sudden, we find out there is a production issue, and the production issue fix requires also a database change. Maybe we need to enlarge the size of a column, whatever. Question is, what migration version number would you now use on the maintenance branch? You could say, well, it's going to be 4. And if you would do that, and you would deploy, what would happen then is that the production database would go from version 0 to version 1 to version 4, which is fine by Flyway. They don't have to be consecutive, they just have to be higher numbers. But then later on, when you start to deploy your master, it says, yeah, I still need to apply those version 2 and 3. By default, Flyway will say, you cannot do that because you're already on version 4. What happened here? There are new migrations that came out of nowhere. So basically what you want is you want a version number that goes here, that goes after version 1, but that comes before version 2. And fortunately, this is actually very trivial because Flyway doesn't just support single number versions. It can support things like major, minor, or batch releases, or however many segments you like. So when you're using this SCM pattern, what I always do is say on maintenance branches, you can never introduce a new migration with a major version number. It always has to be something like version 1.1, for example, where the major version would be whatever the current schema version is of your production database at the moment, and then this can just be consecutive numbers for your patch releases, basically. That also makes it very clear if you're looking at a migration, if it was part of a major release, it's just new functionality, or if it was part of some bug fix that you had to do as part of a maintenance branch. So what will happen if you do this is that on your production database, that's on version 1, you're now developing version 2, you're developing version 3, but that's just upcoming release, so that's not on the database yet. Now you're doing a bug fix. That bug fix will have version 1.1. Then you're deploying the new major release that will have migration version 2 and 3. Everything looks good. However, of course, if you are developing new functionality, you should be continuously integrating that and testing that on some environment, if it's not production. But what that will mean is that on test, initially it will do the same thing. But now we are developing new functionality, and we are deploying version 2, and we are deploying version 3. Oh, and now we have the bug fix, so that's version 1.1. Now, so what about that? Now by default, like I said, Flyway doesn't like this. It doesn't like it if you try to apply a migration with a lower version number than what was already there. And it's a safety mechanism. It's to prevent you from accidentally putting back in migrations that might, logically speaking, have a dependency in ordering on these other ones. In this case, we know that it's not the case. So what you can do with this is you can set a property on Flyway called out of order. You can set that to true. Now the name out of order is a bit deceiving. You might think, if you're setting out of order to true, that it will start applying the new migrations out of order. That's not what it means. It means it's actually okay to apply a new migration that has a lower version number than what was already applied. And that's where the out of ordering comes from.
And the difficulty is that when you are in version 1 and you're already developing version 2,
yes,
and then in the meantime a fix needs to be implemented,
yes,
and that's version 1.1,
yes,
that you would, in continuous delivery, you would always want to look for deploying version 2, because that's the latest version.
If you're going to do continuous delivery to production, this is a non-existent issue, because you're not going to have a separate maintenance branch where you're going to be doing something that needs to happen before the new functionality that you have already developed for the upcoming release. Yeah. Because basically everything that you're developing will be on a single branch that will always be tested and put in production.
Yeah, so as long as version 2 hasn't been deployed yet, you can still go for 1.1.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem starts happening when you do have these two different life cycles of what gets developed and deployed to certain environments versus what gets deployed to production. And that's a very common situation still.
More common, actually.
Yeah. So that's where this is coming from. And what I like about this way of solving this problem is that now the safety net that Flyway gives you, where by default these out of order migrations are not allowed, can still be there in production. It's just that on any other environment where you are doing more regular deploys than what you would be doing to production, you turn it off, because there you know what you're doing, and it's actually desirable that you're going to have out of order. Now this situation changes a bit when you are also going to do feature branching. So that's the next thing I want to talk about. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the model. The idea behind a feature branch is that you say, well, we're going to have some branch that contains integration, stable code, might be master, and then whenever we develop a new functionality, we're going to do it on a separate feature branch. And then when it's done, for whatever your definition of done is, we're going to merge that back into the master, and then it's part of the deployable functionality. And this is an orthogonal concern, basically, when it comes to maintenance branches. You can combine this with maintenance branches, not whatever you want. So what is the problem if you're going to use feature branches? Well, honestly, that's a talk. And it's not even a talk that I have to do here. There are people who have done existing talks on the whole idea of feature branches and why it might be a bad idea. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out this talk by Sam Newman. He's mostly known as the microservices guy who wrote the book. But nowadays he's doing a talk with a very innovative title called Feature Branches and Toggles in a Post-GitHub World. But there are some really interesting ideas in there. I don't necessarily agree with all of them for all situations, but as food for thought, highly recommended. However, back to Flyway, what the problems can be with feature branches there is that you're going to get clashes if you're just going to apply a single version that you increase. So let's say again, we're on version 1 with the production database, and now we're going to develop 2 new features. So we have 2 feature teams and they're both working, and feature team A decides, oh, we actually need some new database table. We're currently on version 1, so we're going to introduce migration version 2. Feature B team B has a similar requirement, so they also say, well, we're on 1, so we're going to create 2. Feature A, team A is done first, so they merge back. Everything is nice and dandy, but now feature team B is done, and when they merge back, they introduce a duplicate version. Now Flyway is definitely not liking that. And this is also not something you can disable. It simply doesn't allow duplicate version numbers because it doesn't know in what order to apply them. Now, I have actually seen teams that will deal with this problem by saying either we're going to force everyone after the merge to manually check if you introduced conflict, and then, well, just change this to 3.
Yeah.
Or actually do not assign a version number
Yeah.
here, just assign a placeholder, merge it, and then after the merge, make sure that you resolve the placeholder to something that logically makes sense. Now that works for situations where you not have a lot of different teams and you don't have a huge code base, but I think this is a huge hassle to do if you have a lot of teams and you have a big code base. So there is a different way to deal with this. And that way is to say, if you're going to do feature branching, then you're accepting the fact, basically by definition, that whatever is done and gets back into master is what should be applied first. That also means that logically speaking, there should never be a logical dependency between migrations developed on one version branch and another version branch. They should be doing different things, right? It would be really weird if you would have 2 feature branches and they both try to add the same new table, for example, right? It's different features. So in that case, we might say, well, we're just going to forgo with the whole out of order thing because it doesn't make sense in a feature branching model anyways. And we'll just use version numbers and enable out of order migrations. What happens if you apply something like a timestamp here as your version number then? Basically what you'll see happening is that these are now my version numbers, so we're on some version of the database. We're going to have these 2 new feature teams. Feature team A needs a new migration, so at this one says, well, at 11 o'clock we decided that we needed a new migration, so we added that. Feature team B, a little bit later on the same day, says, oh yeah, we also need a new migration, and it's actually at 12:30. But feature team B now is done first. So they merge back into master, and master is continuously deployed. Right? So this thing gets into production. Now production is on 12:30. Then later on, later on feature team A is done and they merge back in. And in this case, that's absolutely fine because this version number now is lower than this one, but we have enabled out of order. So Flyway doesn't care, it simply says, well, this is the list of migrations that are applied to the database already. This one, oh, I haven't seen that one yet, so let's just apply that one. And now you're just conflict free. And you're also not pretending that there is still a logical ordering in these things and that somehow things need to be applied one after each other. Because if you're coming from feature branches, it doesn't really make sense to do that anyways. There are some other interesting things that you can do. Let's say if your feature branches do not actually get deployed to environments where the database is kept. So they might still get deployed on like a continuous testing environment, but that's just broken down after your test have run, like you were showing as well, that you can just tear the whole thing down when you're done. If that happens, it's also fine to incrementally add stuff to a migration on a feature branch. You don't have to worry about changing a migration as long as it's not applied yet to a database that's long-lived. So that means that typically if you're using this pattern, whatever gets merged in from a feature branch will just have a single migration. And it will logically contain all of the changes that were needed for a particular story that you were developing on that feature branch.
Wouldn't it be better to, I think you did it, to just have the feature name?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is just a version number, but you should also have the description.
This
should
can
have
clash still.
But this is
In some weird way where they at the same time.
But this is just the version number from a Flyway perspective. This is not the name of the migration file, because the name of the migration file also includes the description, and that one will have the story number, etc.
Can you use that one here too, like Jira issue 1001 as a version?
No. Well, yeah. If it's a Jira issue number, actually yes, because it's a number.
Yeah. As long as it's
and
a
that might
number.
work as well. Yeah, absolutely. It's the same concept, but then instead of applying a timestamp, you could apply a Jira issue number. Absolutely, that would work in exactly the same way.
But if you have multiple projects,
well, you wouldn't expect multiple projects to use the same database with the same Flyway version table, typically. Although I'll talk about that some more as well in a moment.
In my case, there's one database.
Yes.
And there are 8 projects.
I'm going to show you how to do that. That's the last pattern actually. So that's cool. So that's version numbering, right? And these are just some ideas on how you can apply version numbering in a way that makes sense for your projects. Now some other things that are interesting is that, let's say that you want to support multiple database management systems. Now not multiple databases across environments, but you want to support MySQL and PostgreSQL and something else. Then your migrations will probably need to be on a per DBMS, because, well, the DDL syntax is simply not standardized enough that you can use exactly the same migration files on all of those databases. There are actually tools, by the way, like Liquibase, which is very similar to Flyway, that try to tackle this problem by allowing you to write migrations at a higher level, in XML for example, and then generate the correct DDL statements for your particular DBMS. Flyway chooses not to do that, at least I think, again, it might be a feature that they're adding in 5.0, but until then they choose not to do this. But what if you do need to support this? Or, this is a case that I often encounter on projects, what if you're going to say, well, for testing, just some quick Spring integration tests, we're going to stand up an in-memory database using H2 or HSQLDB. And then again, I'm actually fine in this scenario for JPA to create most of my database tables, so that it saves me from having to write all of the H2 specific create table strips. But then there might be, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 tables that are not under control of JPA, so I will still need some stuff for that. Then again, you have this situation where you have basically different DBMSs and you have different requirements for what you want to do with Flyway. And another use case where migration locations can come into play is if you want to have, let's say, additional migrations on certain environments. Now, I've done this on projects where we were using Flyway not just to manage the database schema and reference data, but to also perform fixes on actual data issues. So this was a project where they were deploying fairly often, like daily, and they did need to control, in certain scenarios, errors that were in production data, for example, that came out of third-party systems that would develop this. And they would find out about this and they needed a fix on the database. But that production database was also copied over to acceptance on a regular basis, so you want to be able to do the same fix there. But apart from acceptance and production, that data, that production data, would not actually exist on any of the other environments. So it wouldn't make sense to run those fix migrations on those environments as well. And still, it's really nice if you can apply those fixes to Flyway, because you get all of this traceability, you get automation, you have things in version control, you can see when it happened, right? Instead of just someone saying, oh yeah, I'll open up a Workbench and I'll just fix the production data. And no one knows what happened, when it happened, what broke, that sort of thing. So, how to deal with this? Well, a solution that you can use is you can change the locations where Flyway will be looking for migration files. So by default, it will look on the class path under a DB migration folder. That's built in. It will check for SQL files there. It will also check for a DB migration package if there are any Java migrations there, based on that naming convention that I showed you earlier on, and that's what it uses. But this is configurable, and especially if you programmatically control Flyway, it can be completely dynamic. So one thing you can do is say, well, let's say I'm using Spring as an example here, and so I'm creating a bean that will instantiate Flyway and will run a migration. But the interesting bit here is this. I have a helper method here called getLocations, and only if we actually have a list of my locations, we will apply it to Flyway and we will tell it to do a migration. What do we do in that getLocations here? Well, basically, we're going to use JDBC metadata to find out what database management system are we talking to. So without going over all the code, basically what you're seeing here is we're saying if we're running against an H2 in-memory database, then we're going to read all of the migrations that are available in the H2 folder. However, if we are running against Postgres, external database, then we will simply use the migrations that are available in the Postgres repository. If you would want to, you could also say, well, and in addition to this, I have a shared folder that has migrations that are actually applicable to both environments. You could still do that as well. In this case, I'm saying if it's anything else, I'm just going to log a warning and I'm not going to return any locations because this application only knows about H2 and Postgres. And there shouldn't be anything else that you're connecting to, otherwise we don't know how to do a migration. So better not do a migration then. So that's actually fairly straightforward. And the interesting thing is I actually wrote that code that you just saw on the slide and I used it in some projects. And then in a newer version of Spring Boot, apparently they came up with exactly the same idea and they support this pattern out of the box now. So if you want this, you can actually say my Flyway locations uses a placeholder there called vendor. They will at runtime automatically get replaced with the particular name for your database management system, so Postgres or MySQL or whatever it supports. And you get support for this pattern just straight out of the box. You don't even need to write any custom code. And it works really nicely, it's my experience, to do this, because it gives you still, and that's what I typically like as a developer and architect, I like complete control over these migrations. I don't like tools that try to come up with DDL statements that are executed against my production database schema, I actually want to know upfront what SQL will be run against my production database schema. And I want to write that in a file and I want to put it in version control. That's exactly what you get with this. You can use exactly the same approach to also say, well, I'm going to do some environment specific stuff. So what you see here, for example, is in part of the same method. We're going to say, well, unless we have enabled some property to say skip the data migrations because we're not running on an acceptance production environment, we're going to return 2 migration locations. One with the regular schema-based migrations, and another one that contains data fixes. So you could just have a separate folder that contains your data fixes and ensure that it's only applied against environments where you know that that data that needs to be fixed actually exists. So production-like situations. Again, just an example of what you can do, but this provides a lot of flexibility. So let's say you're now enthusiastic about this stuff, you start applying this in your projects and everyone is writing migrations all the time. What you will find is that very quickly you will have hundreds of migrations if you are on a big project. And that can be a bit tedious to start working with because, well, you're just opening up this DB migration folder in your IDE and then poof, you get this list, and then only the ones at the bottom are relevant because everything else was already applied to production ages ago, and it just becomes a bit of a pain, right? Problem is, you cannot just say, well, I'll just take all of the migrations that were applied to production already and I'm just going to delete them. Because the whole idea behind Flyway is you should be able to run it against an empty database and then just recreate the whole schema from scratch. Also, if you're starting to delete stuff in Flyway, by default, it will complain at runtime where it says, I see in my database schema version table that I applied migrations, but I have no idea what they were, I cannot provide a checksum, whatever, boom, bails out. So simply deleting stuff doesn't work. So what do you want to do here? Well, if you start thinking about this, then an obvious solution to start with is to say, I'm just going to take my current production database schema, and I'm just going to put it in a single new migration, and then I can just get rid of all of the other stuff. Right? That's how you want to get started with this. You just squash everything. And you don't have to do that by hand. You can just literally go to your production database and use SQL dump, MySQL dump, or PG dump, or whatever database you're using to say, give me a dump of the current database schema. That will, by definition, represent the actual production database schema. You may have some reference data that you were managing with Flyway as well. Make sure that you have a migration for that as well. However, if you do that, then, well, you have 1 or 2 new migrations. But then you still need to deal with all of the old migrations that you cannot just simply delete. Also, those new migrations that you just created, as the squashed ones, should never be run against production because it already has all of the information from those.
Wouldn't it be a solution to say, for example, it's now end of 2017. Let's say all the migrations before the beginning of this year are rolled up in one migration.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm doing here. However, if you would only do that, then by deleting the older migrations,
no, you're not deleting them, but I just say roll them up. Just have some mechanism that just.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. By deleting, I mean creating a new rollup. First of all,
yeah.
So that would be a new file.
Yeah.
And then deleting all of the individual migrations.
Yeah, you could do
so
that.
that's exactly what I mean with this. But the problem is, if you only do that, it won't work. Because then, first of all, Flyway will complain about all of the old individual migrations that are no longer there, but that are in the schema version table. And the other thing is you're creating a new rollup. But that should never be applied. So Flyway should know to skip that one if you run it in production. And that's exactly the thing.
Yeah.
So this is exactly what I mean with obvious and not so obvious. Your solution is exactly the obvious thing that you want to do, but then you run into these other problems.
Yeah.
But I have a fix for that. Also, a problem that I had when I wanted to do this was that, okay, there is a moment in time where you say, I'm now going to take literally this dump of the production schema. I'm going to put it on version control. That might not be exactly the same moment where you also want to actually apply the new deploy with your new squashed migrations. There might be some time in between that. And I'm in the unfortunate situation that I'm often hired as a architect/consultant that's not 5 days a week on a customer. So I might actually create a squashed migration this week, and then next week we're planning to actually roll this out. And between those days, developers will start adding new migrations, of course, already to source control. So there is a way to deal with this. And it involves a feature of Flyway called rebasing. Now, I haven't mentioned this before, so I'll quickly explain what this is. It's actually fairly simple. Rebasing is a mechanism that Flyway supports to apply Flyway to an existing database schema that doesn't have a Flyway schema version yet. So basically, you're on an existing project, you're sitting here, you're hearing about this tool, you think, sounds great, I'm going to use it on my next greenfield, because, well, my current project already has a database, so I cannot use it there. Well, you can, using this. The idea behind rebasing is, say, if Flyway encounters a situation where there is an existing database schema, but it doesn't have the Flyway schema version table yet, it will just assume that it's on a given version of your migrations already. And you can configure that version number. It's called the baseline version. It will record that baseline version as the very first row in the schema version table that it will create for you. And then every migration that has a higher version number than that will simply still get applied. So that's called a rebase. It's a mechanism that exists to start introducing Flyway to an existing database. But you can use that, and this is the pattern is a bit tricky, to do this squashing as well in such a way that Flyway will not complain about missing migrations, and that you can also actually create the squashed migration ahead of time of actually deploying. So how does it work? What I did for this is I first of all created a feature branch, or a dedicated branch where I would delete all of the old migrations and then create the new squashed ones, or the roll-ups if you want. That will have a certain version number. In the meantime, developers can just continue to add new migrations on the master or whatever you're using. So what will happen is in production, right, you start with Flyway, it looks nice, but then all of a sudden it becomes actually quite big and you say, oh man, I want to roll this up. So what you do is you create these roll-ups. So what you see here, let me zoom in a bit. There we go. Yeah, of course, that's a difference. Let's go back here. Let's come on, probably. Yes, there we go. So what we do here is we say, well, I'm going to create a new squashed migration. It's called initial schema. This will typically be the result of a MySQL dump or whatever with just your schema. In my case, I also was using Flyway on this project for reference data, so I have some reference data as well. I'm going to merge this back into the master. And in merging that back, I'm also going to delete all of the old migrations that are now contained in this initial schema. In the meantime, other people on the team have already created new migrations, but that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Some of these new migrations that these people created could already have been deployed to several environments. Again, I'm absolutely fine with that. There is no stop the world scenario here where you're saying, please don't do anything until I get back, right? Because that's killing, of course. So now, when you are ready to say I'm gonna start deploying this thing after merging it into master, what you will be doing here is you're gonna say to Flyway, from now on, you're gonna use a new name for your version schema table. And what I chose to do, but that's just an idea, you don't have to do that, is to just apply a date to that to make it also obvious when the schema version table was created. The effect of that is that when you start a Flyway, it's going to act in exactly the same way as when you apply it to a database, existing database, without ever using Flyway. Because it says, well, I'm missing my schema version table. When you do that, you're also going to provide a baseline version to Flyway. And you're going to do that by looking at what is currently deployed on the database that you're applying Flyway to. So let's say this, this thing, you can see a version number here, May 13th, actually corresponds to here. So in this scenario, I found, just by looking, that the production database that I was applying this to had already all of these migrations up until this one, but not this one. So I simply chose a number somewhere in between these versions. And it doesn't actually, that number, that baseline version number, doesn't need to be a number that actually corresponds to an existing migration. It's just a logical number. And Flyway will just say, okay, if you tell me that I'm on that version, I'm just going to put in a baseline there, and I'm going to assume I'm on that version. And then I'm going to see if there are any migrations left that have a higher version number. Well, in this case, there was one. So it's going to apply that one. And that's it. So now, you can simply delete the old schema version table. Flyway will happily just say, if there is a new database that's completely empty, okay, I'm just going to run everything from the top, so it will still be able to recreate your complete database, but it will not complain about migrations that have gone missing, and it will not accidentally try to apply these new rolled up, squashed versions that you have created. Right? And you can just do this periodically, like once a year, or if you're a really active project, maybe a couple of times per year, just to get rid of the hundreds of migrations that will only be appended to over time. So that's the idea here.
Isn't there any feature in Flyway where some people want this? Because it can be scripted, of course, I guess.
You could, but I wouldn't do that, because what I do as part of this is very often you will see things like, okay, my initial migration will have a create table, then there will be an alter table, there will be another alter table, and when I do a roll-up, I don't want to just merge, create, alter, 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 alter. I actually want the net result, so that it's just describing the exact state that the database should be in one go, rather than by changing it within the same migration. So in order to automate that, you would need to have a smart interpreter for all of your DDL statements that would actually calculate the net result of applying it to a database. Well, you might as well just say, I'm going to apply it to a database, and then do a dump. And then you have exactly that. Also, it tends to be faster that way. Tools like MySQL dump, for example, tend to produce an SQL with DDL statements that first disables a number of checks, like foreign key constraint checks or indices and that sort of thing. Then it defines the whole schema, and then it re-enables those things. And that will be typically faster than just applying these things one by one with everything enabled. So actually having an initial schema script, a rolled up script created by your database tool will be the most efficient thing typically to create this stuff.
But that can be scripted too.
Yes, that could very well be scripted actually, very easily as well. Because all you have to do is create an empty schema, apply what you have, and then run a tool like.
Yeah, because manual sounds so tricky.
But that's exactly, this is definitely something that's scriptable in that sense.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't try to derive this from the migrations themselves.
No,
you would need to apply them.
Wouldn't Flyway be able to do it for you?
It could actually, as a new feature.
Yeah,
it can't do it now, but it could provide a feature where it would know for every DBMS how to ask the DBMS to give schema dump.
Yeah.
That it could do. Absolutely difficult. Yeah. Probably easier to automate by a little script yourself.
Yeah.
But it's definitely automatable, absolutely. So that's the idea. And then one more thing. Let's say, and I know almost everyone seems to be in this situation, that you are currently in a situation where you have a single monolithic application on a single database, but you're trying to move away from that, so you're carving out services. This is going to be a variation on the previous pattern where we're using rebasing functionality. So what happens in my experience is when you do this, when you start to extract code, you carve out these new services. Carving out the code is actually the easy part. But if you have a shared database, then saying, well, the new services should also own their own data and it should be completely siloed in their own database, that's going to be really tricky. Because a service might logically speaking be responsible for a database table and by writing changes to it, but you might have all sorts of shared code that is also reading from those database tables. And that's a problem, obviously. Now, you could say, I want to solve all of those problems in one go. So whenever I extract a new service, I'm also going to make sure that I extract all of the corresponding data and that everything will be perfect. That's nice, but in my experience, that's a lot of work, first of all. But also, you might already be able to gain some of the benefits from extracting service code, being able to make that into its own life cycle, deploy it by itself, even if it's still running on a shared database. And then later on, you can actually fix that as well, because you don't want to have a shared database as your end game result, but it might be fine for a temporary situation. But you do want clear ownership. You want to make sure that you know what service is actually responsible for defining and writing to certain tables. Because if you're going to have multiple services writing to the same database table, well, they're not really separate at all. So if you want this, an easy solution for this is to say, whenever I carve out a new service, I'm going to give it its own Flyway schema version table in the shared database. And there it can record its own applied migrations, and it can just do its own versioning of its own partition, basically, of the database schema. And you can use baselining to do this. So let's say that currently you just have monolithic app on a single database, so you have a schema version table. What you could say is, well, we have a lot of integration code in this application, so we want to take that out. We want to have the integration code as a separate service. And we have a bunch of functionality in here that's just used for internal administration. by our own service department, for example. It should not be user facing. So we're going to take that out as well, and we'll put that in its own application. What you could do then is basically say, well, I'm going to first apply the pattern that I just explained to the core application. So instead of putting a version number now in, we're going to create a new schema version core table, and we're again going to have a squash migration. But this squash migration will not contain the tables that we now logically consider to be owned by the extracted services. And then in a similar fashion, we can just use regular rebasing for the extracted service code to say, well, if you're running against a database, but you don't have your own schema version integration table yet, just create it. Assume that you're on a baseline version, and just take it from there, right? And that means that as part of the initial migration file here, that thing can actually define what tables it owns and have to create those statements in there. But again, you don't have to worry about those tables being applied to a database that already has those tables, because it's just baseline. And you can do this for multiple apps. And again, I don't want to say that this is a perfect solution, and when this is in place, you should be happy and say, I'm done with my microservices migration, because you're not. Shared databases are, in most cases, an empty pattern. However, what I have found is that in many cases, when you start doing this on an existing application, a lot of those database tables tend to be fairly stable, especially in the sense that they might be augmented with additional columns, but the stuff that is being read by code that is being left behind after carving out a new service can be fairly stable. I've done this a lot, this pattern, on a project where we're doing a medical record system for healthcare. And if you look at what we store inside of a medical record as the base information, that's not going to change all the time, right? It's pretty stable. We know what we're going to store in the medical record. We're going to add stuff to it, but we're not going to change what's already there. And then this will actually allow you to say, well, I'm going to get the benefits of having extracted services with their own life cycle. I can have our own team develop on that. I can deploy it much more frequently than the core application, which might be subject to all sorts of other constraints by which you cannot do continuous deployment, for example. And then when I'm in that situation, then I can just see how much pain having a shared database actually causes. And then based on that pain, you can decide if it makes sense to say, well, I'm going to take the next step as well. I'm going to extract that as well. Okay? But this doesn't force you to do it all in one go. And I like having choices as an architect instead of being forced to do everything perfectly or not doing it at all. So you can get a lot of benefits out of just having separate lifecycle for your code, still using a shared database.
Question on that schema. Why are there two versions 16? Just side noticed.
There is a version 16, which is a major. Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
The same description.
It's actually, yeah, it also has the same description. Honest answer, no idea.
I was just wondering.
No,
if
it's
was
a very good
something
question.
else.
I probably took this from a local development database,
Yeah,
and I did
okay.
something weird there. Because this should
No, I was just wondering if there
yeah,
was.
it's good that you noticed this. I should just crop it out and pretend it never happened. Yeah. So thanks for that. So that's what I wanted to say about Flyway. So I think what the most important thing to take away from this is if you are working on an application that has any relational database, managing your database schema is really important. If you're still doing it by hand, or if you're still having like separate release instructions with SQL statements that say, whenever we deploy this application, someone should first really execute these SQL statements against the database, please stop. Start considering a tool like Flyway. Flyway has some, I think, well-chosen limitations. If you don't like those, if you do actually want to have support for things like rollbacks, if you do like to have support for defining higher level migrations that are being translated into SQL, have a look at Liquibase. It's a very similar tool, and it does basically the same use case. It just does it slightly differently. It has some different opinions, but using either of those tools is just a huge improvement over not using them and having some manual process in place. What I like about Flyway is that it's, on the one hand, it's pretty lightweight. It does exactly what it says in the box and nothing more, but it does have a ton of flexibility. I showed you some of the options here in this presentation on how you can tune it to do certain things, but if you need more, Basically, it has a full callback mechanism for all of the different steps and phases in the life cycle of applying migrations. You can actually hook in your own code. You can do custom things everywhere. So it's pretty flexible in that respect. It's also actively developed. Like I said, version 5, which is a major release, just came out. And as part of that, the original developer, Axel Fontaine, from a company called Boxviews, which is actually doing the development of this, they are actually planning some commercial add-ons. So the open source version does exactly what I explained here, but they will have some like enterprisey features on top of that. If you do want to have things like rollback support or some other things that they're planning, so that might be worth checking out as well. So that's it. Stop waiting. Start using. Questions?
Yeah. I was wondering, if you're already using Liquibase, are there any reason to use the...
I would say no, probably not. Unless you find that you're using Liquibase in a way that you find it too heavyweight and you want something lighter. But no, I don't have personal experience with Liquibase. What I did at the time was I assessed both Liquibase and Flyway to see which one would fit my purposes best, and I chose Flyway. And I'm still very happy with that, but if you're already using Liquibase, by all means just use that. And I recently had, in preparation for this talk I think, I actually looked at the website of Liquibase, and it turned out that some things that were not there a couple of years ago, when I looked at it, were actually in place now. So you can actually write just plain SQL migrations in Liquibase and that sort of thing. So I think they're very similar.
Yeah, most of the stuff is similar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.